Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Jacqueline Morose, the festival director, and I'm also the program director of Succeed Together. The Literary Festival is a community event, and it's also a fundraiser for Succeed Together, which provides free educational services to low-income children. I want to start off by thanking our sponsors, including Rayo's Homemade, West of Hudson Realty, Montclair State University, Jill Williams Private Wealth Advisor, the Coronis Gifford Foundation, Deirdre and Colbert Narcisse, and many more. And a special thank you to Garth Risk-Halberg for helping us put this together.
Oh, hi, everybody. My name is Katrina Browning, and I'm the Deputy Festival Director for the Succeed Together Montclair Literary Festival. And I just have a few housekeeping items before we begin. As Jackie mentioned, the festival is a fundraiser for Succeed Together, and its funding has been impacted by the pandemic. So if you would like to make a donation, there's a green button, Support Succeed Together's programming, in the middle of at the bottom of the screen there, and a donation would be greatly received. Also, if you have a question for Emily, there's an Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. Reagan will take your questions towards the end of the talk. And finally, if you have not read The Glass Hotel or Station 11, and you should, you can purchase a copy from our festival partner, Watchung Booksellers, via the link in the chat. Thanks.
So we're thrilled today to welcome Emily St. John Mandel, the best-selling author of Station 11 and The Glass Hotel. She'll be speaking with Montclair's own Reagan Arthur, the new publisher of Knopf, which also publishes Emily's books. They'll speak for about 45 minutes and then take questions from the audience. Welcome to you both.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to thank you for having us. And again, a special thanks to Garth for making this happen. He really pulled it together.
I forgot about Garth's involvement on all this.
Yeah. He sent us an email out of the blue and just kind of made it happen.
Yes, he's like that.
Yeah. It's good quality.
Well, I'm very happy to see you in this virtual realm and to be in the virtual presence of my lovely Montclair neighbors and to talk about you and your great books and your most recent one in particular. I was reading a lot of your interviews, and now I'm reading questions that have come up on the screen. And I think the question that comes up so often now, including in my hometown, is what does it feel like to have predicted in fictional form both a pandemic and a financial crisis, it seems.
Right. So, just one second, I have a special guest.
Yes, we have a surprise guest.
Oh, my daughter Cassie. It's Reagan. You want to say hi? Hi.
Are you good at these now?
Cassia does a lot of these. She always crashes them. That makes pretty sensitive. I love you like crazy. All right, would you please close the door? Yeah, my daughter crashes all my events. I think that some people might just be tuning into my events at this point to say hi to my daughter. But
it's definitely a bonus.
It's a bonus, definitely. So here's the thing with pandemics. There's something that happened. And I think that the reason why this moment seems so shocking to us is that it hasn't happened in 100 years. But something that was clear to me in my research for Station 11 is that, you read about the history of pandemics and you start to have this kind of uneasy realization that epidemiologists talk about pandemics in the same way that seismologists talk about earthquakes. Which is just to say that nobody's talking in terms of if there will ever again be another pandemic. So that kind of gives me the feeling that I didn't really predict anything. There was always going to be another pandemic, and there will be another one after this one. And that's not to minimize the horror of this time in any way. But yeah, you start to realize just how often they do happen. Yeah, and the financial crash, that was another unfortunate echo. In my defense, I really thought I was writing literary fiction. When I started writing this book, the economy was great. I was like, wow, the 2008 financial crash, that was bad. Sure, I'm glad nothing like that's going to happen anytime soon. But,
right.
Wow, yeah, here we are, pandemic and crash simultaneously.
Yeah, I loved a quote I read from you where you said you thought you were writing historical literary fiction. Like it
I
was like
did.
so
Yeah.
in the rearview mirror. Like
Yeah, exactly.
Madoff is. I don't want to. I'm going to try my hardest not to give spoilers for the people out there who haven't read it yet. But it is safe to say that there is a Madoff-like character, and I found him fascinating at the time, and I could see why a novelist's imagination would be sparked by that character and that deceit and that just ongoing like build up of, there was just no way out. And
Yeah.
I can't see one of those like quilted French jackets that he was always,
I know.
like, why would anybody wear one anymore? They're just so associated with his like perp walk. But
Yeah.
he was a weirdly like an empty and yet fascinating figure. And you actually made your Madoff character, I felt, much more sympathetic because we spend time with him as a character in your novel, but I found his character very interesting in the way that you explained him in a sense that I don't think any of us will really understand Bernie Madoff, and
Right.
perhaps there's no reason to, but
Right.
I like the way that you tried to create a person that might become that person.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, where I kind of fall on that guy is that I feel like Madoff himself is not a particularly interesting figure. You read, if you read his prison interviews, he's just such a garden variety narcissist. Now, it was everybody else's fault. If only the investors hadn't pushed him so hard for those, unrealistically high returns. They all should have known it was a scam, et cetera, et cetera. So I found him kind of uninteresting. So I felt like I had to invent a completely new character who was more interesting than him. But like you, I was fascinated by that crime. The scale of it was so spectacular. A 65 billion with a B dollar Ponzi scheme. And I have to say, my initial point of fascination with the crime was actually with the Ponzi staff. So that billionaire guy, he wasn't going to sit down and format all those fake account statements by himself. You got to have a staff for that. So I want to say 6 or 7 of his employees went to prison for, formatting fake account statements, generating all these false lists of trades, wiring money back and forth across the Atlantic to look like European trading income. So there was this whole apparatus in place. And at the time when the story broke, I had a really great day job. I was a part-time administrative assistant in a cancer research lab at the Rockefeller University. And I had really great coworkers. And, I just found myself thinking about the camaraderie that you have with any group of people who work closely together. And then just imagine how much more intense that would be if you were showing up at work on Monday, not to publish books, but to perpetuate a massive crime together. Like that's insane. So yeah, that was what really interested me about that crime.
I love that section of the novel where it switches to the back office, the people that were doing all that just as a daily bit of their job. I mean, that was not bit of their job, that was their job. And then there was another interview I read with you where you talked about consensual reality. Like they've all agreed that this is normal, that they're going to do this, that this is okay. And then you can see it as it's all crumbling with various reactions, which I won't give away. But I also was excited when I got to that section of the novel because it reminded me of the novel that I did edit, which was Then We Came to the End. And I don't know if you read that.
I love that novel. I did. That was a big influence on that section.
I'm so glad.
Yeah. As I love, there's been so much research on this, but there's something fascinating about that phenomenon where you'll do something as part of a crowd, or to put it in a more dark way, as part of a mob, that you would never do as an individual. So yeah, I liked the idea of, in Joshua Ferris's novel, of like taking that kind of workplace environment, but mapping it onto a crime. Like, if it's not advertising, it's actually a Ponzi scheme. That was kind of an interesting way for me to think about it. And, it's interesting. That chapter is actually the first part of the book that I ever wrote. But because my process is so haphazard and crazy, that ended up being chapter 10. But yeah, I think that psychologically, it's easier to say we crossed a line than I crossed a line. You'll do things as part of a crowd that you just wouldn't do by yourself.
Right. I loved also, I was thinking about the novel and the way that for people who haven't read it, I find it very hard to sum up in like a linear one-line kind of description.
Same. It's a struggle.
So, okay, good. So I'm not going to try. I'm going to get to I'm going to say what I was about to say, and then I'll try to circle back to something else, much like your novel does. But I love the various aspects of work that sort of underlie these characters' lives, and the way that you consider really the way that work is part of everybody's life, even if, you know, that you've got the shipping concern, you've got the hotel workers, there's menial labor, and then there's more like high finance, and all the ways that someone's job defines them and defines their life, either on a very, you know, they have they have to work to live, to eat, or else, you know, that's a concern long past, but they sort of have to maintain the lifestyle that their work has enabled, and all these people in different sort of strata. And I think the most moving character, one of the most moving characters in the book, is the woman Olivia, because she's older, and she had her moment, and it's past as an artist, and she's just sort of I think fading. Yeah, and so reliant on the kindness of someone who turns out to not be kind to her at all.
Right.
And just that kind of person, that sort of very New York person who came to New York to be an artist, or I can't remember, she was in New York as an artist, she had some modicum of success, and you just know that person, you've seen them, you might know them, you might read about them, but they've just never quite made it. And how do they live day to day? And here she finally thinks she might, I won't give anything away, but anyway, the fact of her just pursuing a dream that was always just out of reach, in the way that I think so many people do in their lives. I thought that was very moving.
Well, thank you. Yeah, she was one of my favorite characters to write. One of my organizing principles, I guess, for the book was that I wanted to write about money, which just kind of came up naturally as a topic from having a white collar crime. That, you know, if you write about a Ponzi scheme, you're inevitably writing about money. I grew up in a really working class environment. And so I feel like money is just, you know, I've had the privilege of seeing what the relationship with money looks like, you know, in different social strata, and seeing how, I would say, culturally different people are who have always had a financial cushion, you know, just in terms of their understanding of the world. And that's really interesting to me. With Olivia, the painter, I was thinking about this phenomenon. It's interesting and kind of dark that I've seen with artists over the years. So I used to be a dancer. I did contemporary dance pretty seriously before I was a writer. And, you know, in both those worlds, you meet artists of all different kinds, you know, the actors, the musicians, painters, everybody else. And there's this phenomenon I've seen over and over again where, you know, the young, very committed artist living a bohemian lifestyle in his or her 20s or even 30s, you know, refusing to really have much to do with financial planning, say, or looking ahead to the future, refusing to have anything to do with this sort of conventional world, which includes financial planning. That commitment to bohemia, you know, it's kind of brave and charming when you're 23. But you get to be 50, 60, 70, the picture looks pretty dark, you know, and I've seen that a few times where, yeah, you know, it's a shtick that doesn't age very well. And unless somebody has real artistic success, which, if we're to be honest, is kind of like winning the lottery, you know, that's pretty unusual for that to happen in any artistic field. Then yeah, it can get pretty dark. You know, you can get the Olivia Collinses of the world, sort of living off family, essentially. You know, she's totally reliant on her sister. So yeah, it's an unfortunate phenomenon that I feel like I've seen a few times.
Yeah, one of the lines that I mentioned to you earlier when we talked about the book that I loved was again about money, where one of the characters, after a lifetime of not having any, suddenly does, and she looks out at her vast new estate and thinks luxury is a weakness. You know, she's got people waiting on her hand and foot. She doesn't have to do anything. And from a distance, I know that can look like a great set of circumstances. But I thought that was so astute to think, like, it's a, you know, you can be weak. You are just completely tended to and cared for,
right.
and you don't have to do anything, and it makes you weak. And you can see that the people in your novel pay a price for that.
Yeah, definitely. I've been thinking about that idea for a long time. Years, a million years ago when I was in my 20s. I remember being at a cafe. I don't even remember the city, but there was a couple sitting nearby who, they were well-dressed. And from their conversation, I gathered they had much more money than I did. They were talking about travel. And the man was saying, look, I hate spending the money to fly first class. It's, costs a fortune, but you can't fly economy. I mean, you just can't. It's so uncomfortable. Like, how would you even what? Like, it just didn't compute for him. And I flew economy all the time because I had no money and my family was on the other side of the continent. But so it just kind of stuck with me from that moment. Like, that was a guy who just kind of couldn't. He'd been sort of coddled to the point where an economy ticket was like unthinkable. Yeah.
Well, speaking of your family on the other side, you grew up on a small island off of Vancouver, is that right?
I did, yeah. So I grew up on Vancouver Island until I was 10, and then we moved to Denman Island, which, for anybody who's read Station 11, that's the island in Station 11. I just slightly changed the name, and it's exactly the way I described it in that book. Beautiful, claustrophobic, rural.
And you were homeschooled, is that correct?
I was, yeah. It's funny. When I say that in the States, sometimes people get this sort of tactful look on their face because, I think there's a connotation down here, or there used to be, of homeschooling, kind of being the province of these hardcore anti-science fundamentalist Christians. You don't want the kids to learn the theory of evolution. But yeah, my parents were hippies, and that was just kind of the counterculture, back to the land thing to do. So and also the schools in my area weren't great. So they kept me home for kindergarten just as an experiment. And that somehow just kept going until I was 15.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I've read that the island is also sort of featured. The hotel of the Glass Hotel is such a beautifully described and alluring place. Like, I'm sure we would all want to go there if we could, but it does not sadly exist.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. I wish it did. I had kind of an epic promotional tour for Station 11. It just kept going and going and going. So I've stayed in a lot of hotels over the past 5 or 6 years. And I think at a certain point, I was just thinking about, well, what's my ideal hotel? So that's the hotel in the book. I wish it existed. The place exists. You can go to a place called Quatsino, at the very northernmost tip of Vancouver Island. No roads in or out. It's a tiny hamlet deep in an inlet. You get there on a water taxi. But yeah, there's no 5-star hotel parked next to it, unfortunately.
Oh, well, we can dream.
We can dream. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about dialogue because I was so impressed by your dialogue and by the very, I felt, organic and natural way that you have your characters communicate. And it's a kind of like technical, perhaps overly writerly question, but I know that are you working on the Station 11?
No, not at all. That I have no contractual involvement with that, but I am working on the Glass Hotel adaptation, which has been, I have to say, it's been really fun. I mean, also sometimes really hard, as any new project will be, but yeah, it's just a completely different form, and it's been kind of exciting. I love writing novels, but after 5 novels, it's kind of fun to do something completely different. So yeah, I appreciate your comment about dialogue. I feel like that is, or maybe was, a real weakness of mine. So I think that might be something that I really pay extra attention to when I'm in revisions, because I'm not super confident about it all the time.
Yeah. Well, I felt like it made me think that as you translate this into this, it turns out, into a film, like that must be an easier process for you than it might be for others, just because it's all dialogue.
It might be, yeah. And also, I have to say, working on the adaptation, it gives me a new understanding and appreciation for why the TV and film versions of our favorite books are always so different. I turned in a draft of the pilot script that was, it wasn't really like the first section of the novel, but it was pretty close. And yeah, the comments back, it was like, look, every single scene has to drive the story forward and have an incredible level of tension. So yeah, it made me realize why, you'll read your favorite novel and then you see it on the screen and it's like car chase, bedroom scene, car chase, bank heist. It's just like, yeah, crazy action. And I have to say, a fun thing about working on the adaptation is that I think it will be quite different from the book. And so it's like I kind of have this, not quite a do-over, because I don't regret the way I put the book together, but an opportunity to tell the same story in a different way, it's kind of fun.
Yeah, I'll bet. There are ghosts in this, and I wondered if you, for people who think they don't like to read ghost stories, I think there might be some. I don't know why, but
they're out there.
There's so many different elements to this. It's a financial thriller. It's a family saga. It's a I don't know how else I could synopsize it accurately, but I don't think many people would necessarily expect ghosts to appear in a book like this. And I wondered if you set out to write a ghost story.
Really
not a ghost story,
right? But it kind of is, yeah. This is what happens when you write without an outline, honestly. Yeah, I don't write with an outline. I just kind of wing it and see what happens. And my first drafts are about as catastrophic as one might expect in those circumstances. So yeah, my original idea with this book was to write a pretty straightforward white-collar crime novel. It was going to be centered pretty tightly around this Madoff-style Ponzi scheme. I was going to have sections for the investors, the perpetrators, the trophy wife figure who I was imagining. Yeah, everybody kind of caught up in this. But sometimes when you're working without an outline, a book can take some pretty unexpected directions. And I think, to be honest, I just kind of always wanted to write a ghost story. So yeah, this book was really hard to write. And there was a long period where I just kept thinking, look, this is just too weird. I have to break this up into 2 books. At one point, I was drafting an email to my agent. Like, do you think it would be crazy to break this into A, a ghost story, and B, a financial thriller? But yeah, I kept it all mashed in together. I revised it a million times. And I'm happy with the way it turned out, but I've been struggling for like 2 years to come up with the elevator pitch. It's a really weird novel.
I think that most of my favorite novels I could not possibly describe in one line. So I understand that.
Right.
And one of the things that I loved about it was I started reading it, and it's Paul. I'm terrible with remembering names, but that's the first person we meet, right? And so you will start reading it thinking that this is a young man's sort of falling apart novel, or maybe a college. It goes in such an unexpected direction from those first scenes, in the way that I think of like a David Sedaris essay that starts in one place,
right,
and then goes through these loops that you don't even really see until you're in the middle of them,
right, and
then to come back. And I just so admired the way that you led us from one character, and then you bravely, like, we don't see him for a while.
It's true. Like, yeah,
there he goes. And he's done something pretty dramatic, and then well, it's time to move on. And I didn't even have time to miss him because so much else was happening, and it was just all just sort of hurtling forward. But only when I stepped back and when it was all over did I realize kind of the intricacy of that structure. So I just have to take my hat off to you. And now hearing you talk about how unoutlined and sort of messy the writing process was, I hope that any would-be writers out there take heart in knowing like that it can be messy and still look like a beautifully sort of perfectly put together package at the end. I thought that was
thank you.
Pretty remarkable.
I really appreciate that. I have to give a ton of credit to my editors for this. Jenny Jackson is amazing. Yeah, I think that phenomenon of a character like Paul just kind of disappearing for a long stretch, that's a carryover from the original structure I had for this book, which was based really closely on David Mitchell's novel Cloud Atlas, which I love. And for anybody who hasn't read that book, it's got this incredible symmetrical structure that just kind of marches forward and then backward in time. So if section A is set in the 1650s, section B is in the 1800s, I don't know exactly because my copy's in a box, but you could map that structure as A, B, C, D, C, B, A. So that was my original idea. And it absolutely did not work. The structure was the thing that I struggled with the most in the revisions for this novel. But I think that some sort of shadow of it remains, in the way that the book begins and then ends with Vincent in the water. And yeah, it doesn't quite go. Yeah, I guess Paul is I don't want to give away the whole thing, but yeah, you do see Paul in that kind of symmetrical way too. But yeah, I love David Mitchell's structure, that way of visiting a character and a place in a really intense way, and then it's like on to the next, and then coming back to it.
Yeah. Did you set out, for people who've read both books, they will know that beloved character from Station 11 reappears. And did you always have that in mind, or did that just suddenly occur to you?
I did have that in mind. Yeah. All of my books stand alone. Like, you definitely don't need to have read Station 11 to read The Glass Hotel. But sometimes I just get attached to individual characters. And I really liked writing Miranda in Station 11, which posed a pretty obvious problem because I do kill her off in the book, which, the book's been out for 6 years. I feel like that's not a crazy spoiler. Yeah, it's fair. So I knew I wanted to use her again, but I had killed her off. So there's a chapter toward the end of Station 11 where a couple of characters, Kirsten and August, are sitting by the side of the road. And they're playing this game that they've clearly been playing for years, where they just kind of riff on the idea of alternate universes. An alternate universe where, for example, the flu pandemic didn't happen and civilization didn't collapse. So I was trying to lay the groundwork for that chapter to reuse characters from Station 11. Like, look, guys, it could be an alternate universe. And then I picked that up in The Glass Hotel. There's an early chapter where Vincent's walking down the street. Where Vincent's walking down the street. Sorry again. And she's and she's kind of playing the same game just with herself, riffing on this idea of, imagine an alternate universe where, where that terrifying new flu hadn't been quite so swiftly contained. So that's a long-winded way of saying I was always going to reuse Miranda. And then, tried to lay the groundwork for this idea of parallel realities, which I know that not everybody is picking up. I had a really lovely review recently that talked about The Glass Hotel transpiring in the years just before the Georgia flu wipes out civilization. It's like, no, yeah, it's people miss stuff.
I had a thought in my head and it just completely left me. But I was going to say about Station 11. I started rereading it last night in last minute preparation for this discussion, and as you know, it has been selling very well in these recent weeks. People seem to be really turning towards Station 11, The Plague, Stephen King's The Stand, and what some of us on the publishing side have found surprising, just that people are leaning into fictional accounts of what we're going through. And then when I was rereading again last night, I thought, well, actually, it's weirdly comforting, those opening scenes of just like total instant just chaos. And I mean, it's like, well, okay, but ours isn't that bad. Like, we didn't have to clear out of the city in 3 hours.
Yeah,
grocery carts.
Exactly. It could have been so much worse. So,
so much worse.
But of
course, things do get a little worse.
Yeah, they do get much worse.
But it feels like in the moment of this, like on this like slow motion, whatever it is we're experiencing, there's a comfort in your imagining a truly worst case scenario.
Yeah, that's as bad as it gets. But that raises an interesting point, which is that something I just didn't think about in all my reading about pandemics was the prelude to pandemic, where, I think I sort of imagined it as this kind of on-off switch, like you're in a pandemic or not in a pandemic. But with the coronavirus, it just approached so slowly. And the experience in New York and presumably Montclair was, like we knew it was coming, but we didn't really believe it because pandemics aren't really something that happens, what? It's not like the 1918 flu. But at the same time, we were sort of like stocking up on groceries, but in kind of a casual way. You don't want to get too crazy. Yeah, and it just, the dread of the approaching pandemic was something that honestly hadn't occurred to me. So yeah, if I were rewriting Station 11, which I'll never do, I think that would be in there.
Yeah. Yeah, the slow motion part of it. But as you say, people, I mean, there are people whose whole jobs is, it's not if, it's when, you know, to predict the pandemic. Like, they know. I heard an interview with Michael Lewis recently. I haven't read his, what is it, the fifth? Anyway, he was talking to a government expert talking about like the worst case, you know, what are you all planning for all the time? And it's, you know, nuclear attack, nature related or the crises, disasters. And then there was a pause. And then that was the fifth thing, whose name I'm forgetting, because he couldn't even bring himself to say it out loud, but it was pandemic. Like,
right.
That was, you know, there's people in, or there were until recently, whose whole jobs were to prepare and predict.
Sure wish they'd still been there. That would have been nice. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just looking at my clock because I want to make sure we can get to questions, but I think we have a couple more minutes. So you mentioned some writers, and I know I'm always interested to hear about writers who other writers admire or turn to, and I wonder if you have any current or longtime favorites that you always sort of recommend or think about when you're writing.
Yeah, I do. I'm kind of obsessed with the novel Sweet Française by Irene Nemirovsky. It's just that's kind of the prose style I feel like I'm always writing toward. It's just such a masterpiece of clarity and lucidity. That kind of unadorned style really appeals to me.
It so captures the moment of like living through, like,
living through horror
before, like, in real time.
Yeah,
it's like unbelievable, and yet here it is really happening. I love that book.
Yeah, and she gets that you have to focus on the people, you know, for it to be interesting. You can't really just talk about the thing, you know, which for anybody who hasn't read it is the Nazi invasion of Paris. So that's a book I turn to a lot. For contemporary writers, I find I'm really drawn to writers who are doing really interesting things with form. So I loved Charles Yu's new novel, Interior Chinatown. You know, the way it's like 90% screenplay, but it's also the most moving novel. It's kind of incredible. I love Jennifer Egan for the same reason. A Visit from the Goon Squad. It's one of my favorites. It's so good. Yeah. And another writer whose work I really admire is Dan Shawn. It's spelled like chaos, but with an N. And he's one of those writers, I'll kind of follow him anywhere. You know, I would not describe myself as somebody who's into horror as a genre, but his novel Ill Will, which is pretty like straight up horror, it's just an amazing book. It's one of the very few books that I've reread. So those are people who I turn to. Yeah,
I love all of them. He has a new book coming pretty soon, I think.
Oh, does he? Okay, that's exciting.
Inside tip for you there.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Okay, now I'm going to try. I think we have a ton of questions, so I want to make sure we have time to answer them, if I can do this correctly, which is always a question in itself. Wait a minute. Maybe our guides here can help me out.
Hey, I see an ask a question thing at the bottom with 7 questions. Is it not going for you?
I'm seeing comments. Hang on. Okay, I think I see them.
Okay.
And they get votes. How democratic of us. Okay. I think I maybe just asked this one. What kinds of books have you found yourself reading during the outbreak?
During the outbreak, so I just read the worst possible book to read during the outbreak, which is The Plague by Albert Camus. I was reading it for a vintage book club that we did on Zoom last night, and it was a really fun event. You know, my co-panelists were like the chair of the French department at Yale and the person who's doing a new translation of The Plague for Knopf. So I felt extremely underqualified on the panel, but it was fun. It was really interesting. Hard book to read during a pandemic, though, so I wouldn't actually recommend it. I've just been reading fiction. I'm really concerned with the fate of independent bookstores in all this. You know, they're just among my favorite spaces on earth, and independent booksellers. I published 3 books with a tiny small press before Station 11 was published by Knopf. And independent booksellers championed my work when like nobody else cared about it. So, I'm worried about them, which is how I justify spending a ton of money on books these days. I have like boxes coming in. So yeah, I have a stack of contemporary fiction I've been trying to get to. I just read a book I loved, which wasn't quite a novel. It was like a memoir hybrid called The White Book by Han Kang, who's best known for The Vegetarian. That was really beautiful. I loved it. So yeah, that's one I would recommend.
Thank you. The next question is, we were wondering about your research process as an author. Your novels have so much detail and such character depth. How do you go about writing them?
It's generally like there'll be a lot of detail, but it's about something that I was just kind of naturally interested in that I decided to put in a novel. And I feel like the bar I'm going for, which sounds awful, but is probably true of most fiction writers, is plausibility. So I'm not actually an expert on financial instruments, but I did read a lot about Madoff's Ponzi scheme in order to be able to like drop a few lines of dialogue to make it seem like I really knew what I was talking about in a very profound level. So yeah, that was the case of the financial stuff. The shipping industry is just something that's interested me for years. So I've just read a lot of it kind of naturally. Yeah, I don't feel like I do super deep dives for the sake of a novel usually. I'm usually just trying to clear the bar, well, of plausibility, just so the novel works. I feel like if you dump in too much research, then the readers start skipping pages. But you have to have enough research that it sounds like you know what you're talking about. So yeah, I'm always trying to hit that sweet spot.
I think you did.
Thank you.
You have said that many of your novels are about bad decisions. What interests you about that approach to storytelling and character?
I think that... Reagan, are you still there?
I am. My
batteries. Okay. Oh, no. Okay.
It's another crisis, another technical crisis.
Yeah, in-person events are so technically easier. Yeah, so bad decisions. I think they just kind of interest me in a morbid way as a topic, partly. They can be really great starting points for a novel because A, you get a ton of character development. Who is this person and why did they make this terrible decision? And B, you have this inherently dramatic setup. Like, oh my God, a bad decision has happened. Let's just follow this and see how catastrophic it could possibly be. So yeah, it's a good way to get a book rolling, I think is really what it is.
Yeah. I don't know if I should be reading. That question was from Catherine Platt. I'm going to be reading the people's names unless you tell me not to. Somebody tells me not to. Next, from Ariel Zeitlin, I hope I've said that right. How does it feel to have your vision of a pandemic be proved eerily true?
I am so happy that my vision of Station 11 is not proving eerily true. That pandemic was so much worse. It has been kind of a weird time in that way. There were an awful lot of tweets just as the pandemic was arriving, so like early March, about my having predicted the future. And I found that really kind of awkward and uncomfortable because there was always going to be another pandemic. So, it's, yeah, I don't feel like I predicted anything. But it is a weird time in that way. I'm not loving being the sort of poster girl for pandemics, I'm happy that people are turning to my work, but I sure wish they were buying Station 11 for another reason. This is really the worst possible reason for a novel to be selling well. Yeah,
but I think people clearly get a kind of comfort out of it in a diversion, an intelligent diversion. So here's a question. Wait, I just had one from someone we know. Garth Halberg asks, I wonder what else you might have learned from dance that applies to writing fiction. Leave it to a fellow fiction writer to ask that good question.
It's a good question. So there are a couple of things. Dance requires such an intense level of discipline. And I think that carries over not just into fiction, but probably into anything you do after dance. I think that my dance background probably would have made me a more disciplined attorney or professor or whatever else I might have done. But yeah, it's definitely been helpful, just that kind of commitment to the work and that mindset. I would say also that dance is a way harder career than fiction. Writers like to complain, like just generally, but also, to complain about the difficulties of the writing life. But God, it's so easy compared to being a dancer, it's a bad feeling to get a bad review, but a bad review will never be as bad as being in an audition, so being in a room with 200 other women in skin tight clothes with a number pinned to my chest, competing for one job. Like that's horrible. So yeah. And also, I can blow out my knee and I'll still be a novelist, which is not true of dance. So yeah, it's a really good contrast with writing. And yeah, I guess the discipline is the biggest thing.
Right. Well, and there's, I'm sure, some parallel in choreography I could grasp
yeah, definitely.
In terms of making these characters move around in a way that's going to come together.
Right. Yeah, it does often feel like literal stagecraft, the way you're trying to maneuver your characters through the hotel or wherever.
Yeah. Beth Early asks, yours is the second book I've read employing, I like this question, it's very specific, employing boldface type as some emphasis, I assume, throughout the book. Can you describe if the boldface type has particular meaning or forms a stream of some sort?
It doesn't. I'm trying to think of where the boldface text is. I guess in the Vincent sections, there are these sort of bold-faced subheaders. Yeah, it doesn't really have a special meaning to me. I don't really have a ton of control over the interior of a book, in terms of the design. I assume if I hated the interior design of a book, I could probably veto something or other. But yeah, I could, right? That's always been my approach to covers. Like, if I hate it, I'll veto it, but it's not really my decision. Yeah, there's really nothing going on with the boldface type.
Okay. Nikki asks, Station 11 is being turned into a TV show. How do you feel about its translation to screen? And then Reagan interjects to remember that my old author and friend Patrick Somerville is the one writing it. Yeah. But you say you have no involvement in it, so I don't know.
No contractual, right? No contractual involvement, but I'm friends with Patrick, so we text every now and again, so I'll get updates. It's really exciting. I feel like it's in really good hands with him. It's going to be really different from the book, and that's fine. I feel like it kind of has to be to work as a TV series. And a really wonderful thing about having no contractual involvement is there's zero pressure. I can just sit back and watch it as an audience member. Yeah, so my understanding is they've shot a couple of episodes and they're editing those. And poor Patrick is writing the end of Station 11 during a pandemic, which must be surreal. Yeah, that seems really difficult to me. So yeah, he's got a hard job. But I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with it.
Yeah, it's interesting that some writers just can't bear, I think, to see that switch, and some get very involved in the whole process, and some are happy to just let someone else take over. I can see the rationales for each. I think it just depends on your personality.
Yeah, depends on the project too. By the time the Station 11 TV series happened, I'd just been dealing with Station 11 for such a long time. It was like 5 years after publication, and I was so immersed in the Glass Hotel, I just didn't really want to go back to this previous project. But with the Glass Hotel, I sold the TV rights before the book came out. And so it was still really new and kind of exciting. So yeah, that was the big difference for me.
Yeah. Smita asks, my colleagues and I wanted to introduce your novel to our 9th graders as a part of the curriculum, but are shying away because of the content. On the other hand, the book proves how art transcends disaster. I assume this is Station 11.
It sounds like Station 11.
Yeah. What is the place of art in life? Do you tend to avoid books that are too real?
No, I don't avoid those books. One of my favorite books of the past few years was Preparation for the Next Life by Atticus Lish, which was published by a tiny press and won the Penn Faulkner. And it's just an extraordinary novel. It has the most graphic scene of violence I have ever read. It's just harrowing. And it absolutely works in the context of that book. It doesn't feel gratuitous. It feels like an integral part of the story. So I wouldn't say that I shy away from that. You know, in terms of Station 11, like I certainly didn't write it with a ninth grade audience in mind. I have met readers in that age group. So yeah, I guess to address the question of the role of art, it's hard to talk about this without sounding pretentious, but I think that it reminds us of civilization, you know, that there's something out there beyond just ourselves. And I would venture to say that that might be important at a time like this. It's certainly been important for me to read novels and, you know, written by other people. And yeah, just kind of be reminded of this broader world now that we're all in lockdown.
Yeah. Oh, here's a question for me, which I will come back to if we have time. As a writer, Alba Reyes wants to know, as a writer, how do you balance the time for writing and also reading? Do you spend days lost in a book and then write, or can you do both?
I try to do both, but you know, to be honest, like there's just never enough time to write. It's kind of my experience where, you know, I had a day job as an administrative assistant until a year after Station 11 came out. So I was always really used to kind of juggling writing with this day job. And then I quit my day job a year after Station 11 came out. But then I had a kid like 6 months later. So that sure doesn't free up time. You know? So yeah, it's just this constant, insane juggling act to try to get any work done. It was easier when the preschools were open, but now, yeah, in quarantine, it's really difficult. There are often moments when I'm not really in the right state of mind for serious work. You know, I'm exhausted. But sometimes in those moments, you do find yourself in the right state of mind to do some reading. So I try to kind of approach my days that way. If I have some childcare at a moment when I have some energy, you know, early in the day, then I'm giving that over to writing. And I save the mindless tasks, you know, like paying the gas bill or whatever, and also reading for later on at night when I'm too tired to do really good work of my own.
Yeah, I don't know how people with small children get almost anything done, let alone create great novels. Sorry. Okay. I can't get past this question. For Reagan, what one quality in a person's writing most contributes to their novel's success? I'd have to say it's more than one. I would say my two favorite sort of aspects of any novel are voice and story, which is a huge swath of possibility. But I don't think I personally respond to books if they don't have a great voice and also a great story to tell and a great way to tell it. But man, that covers that encompasses a lot of great books in that very under that very big umbrella. So I hope that's helpful. Beth Miller asks, Emily, what made you switch from dance to writing as your main passion?
I just didn't love dance anymore. It was all I'd wanted to do for my whole life, for the time I was 6 years old. And then I graduated from the School of Toronto Dance Theatre, a contemporary program, a conservatory program, contemporary dance. And I just realized I didn't love it anymore. It was like all the joy had just kind of gone out of it. So I'd always written just as a hobby since I was a little kid. And I just started to take it more seriously. So I have no formal training as a writer, but I've been reading and writing for my whole life.
Well, I think that echoes or supports my theory, which is that you really, to be a great writer, you have to be a great reader first. You have to have that sort of foundational, not just knowledge of how to write, but the sense of how to read and what readers love to sort of know how to deliver it back to them. I think I'm seeing new screens popping up that tell me.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're near the end.
Yes. Did you want to? I think there's one more question, or if you want to ask one more question, go ahead. It's up to you.
Emily, if you have it in the tank, what type of character do you most enjoy creating, and what type of character do you find yourself drawn to create? That comes from Cynthia Katai.
Oh, okay. I guess morally ambiguous characters. I find those to be the most interesting. And maybe there's an argument to be made that they're all morally ambiguous, but I really liked writing Paul in The Glass Hotel, who's kind of the villain of the book. You know, not as much as the Ponzi scheme guy, but he's pretty shady. But he was really interesting to write. I think those characters are the ones I find the most interesting.
He's a great character. I was so disappointed in him.
Everybody is.
In such a believable way, you know.
Yeah,
yeah. It's just like, oh, you know, you root for someone, you think. Anyway, I won't go on. Anyway,
yeah,
thank you, Emily. It was great to see you and to talk about The Glass Hotel and Station 11 and everything you do. So thanks for taking this time.
Likewise. Thank you for doing this. I really enjoyed this.
I'm glad. And I'm glad I've never let the audience see you sweat, but guys, it was touch and go for me technically. So I'm glad I made it.
You did great, Reagan. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to Succeed Together and to everybody out there watching and listening for supporting such a great organization. And I hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Emily and Reagan. Thanks for being here with us. And I just wanted to thank our festival sponsors and event partners and festival friends, our volunteers and festival staff, especially Cynthia Katay and Eli Frank at the back there helping us with our tech. Thank you. As well as everyone who's helped us continue with our author events during this time. And on that note, we have our next event on Saturday, May the 9th, with Eric Larson, the author of The Splendid and the Vile. He's going to be in conversation with Christina Baker-Klein. It's online event only, tickets available now for $10, and you can find all the details on our website at succeedtogether.org/events. And on that note, thank you, Emily. Thank you, Reagan. And good night, everyone. Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.